Part 2. Bum boy, said Joe. Bum boy, spluttered Mr. Spud. What else do they call you at school, son? The bog roll kid. Mr. Spud shook his head in disbelief. He had sent his son to the most expensive school in England, St. Cuthbert's School for Boys. The fees were £200,000 a term, and all the boys had to wear Elizabethan ruffs and tights. Here is a picture of Joe in his school uniform. He looks a bit silly, doesn't he? So the last thing that Mr. Spud expected was that his son would get bullied. Bullying was something that happened to poor people. But the truth was that Joe had been picked on ever since he started at the school. The posh kids hated him because his dad had made money out of loo rolls. They said that was awfully vulgar. Bottom billionaire, the bumwipe heir, master plopper paper, continued Joe, and that's just the teachers. Most of the boys at Joe's school were princes, or at least dukes or earls. Their families had made their fortunes from owning lots of land. That made them old money. Joe had quickly come to learn that money was only worth having if it was old. New money from selling toilet rolls didn't count. The posh boys at St. Cuthbert's had names like Nathaniel Septimus Ernest Bertram Lysander Tybalt Zacharias Edmund Alexander Humphrey Percy Quinton Tristan Augustus Bartholomew Tarquin Imogen Sebastian Theodore Clarence Smythe. That was just one boy. The subjects were ridiculously posh too. This was Joe's school timetable. Monday, Latin, straw hat wearing, royal studies, the study of etiquette, show jumping, ballroom dancing, debating society, scone eating, bow tie tying, punting, polo, the sport with horses and sticks, not the mint. Tuesday, ancient Greek croquet, pheasant shooting, being beastly to servants class, mandolin level 3, history of tweed, nose in the air hour, learning to step over the homeless person as you leave the opera, finding your way out of a maze. Wednesday, fox hunting, flower arranging, conversing about the weather, history of cricket, history of the brogue, playing stately home top trumps, reading Harper's Bazaar, ballet appreciation class, top hat polishing, fencing. Thursday, antique furniture appreciation hour, Range Rover tire changing class, discussion of whose daddy is the richest, competition to see who is best friends with Prince Harry, learning to talk posh, rowing club, debating society, chess, the study of coats of arms, a lecture on how to talk loudly in restaurants. Friday, poetry reading, history of wearing corduroy, topiary class, classical sculpture appreciation class, spotting yourself in the party pages of Tatler Hour, duck hunting, billiards, classical music appreciation afternoon, dinner party discussion topic class. However, the main reason why Joe hated going to St. Cuthbert's wasn't the silly subjects. It was the fact that everyone at the school looked down on him. They thought that someone whose papa made their money from toilet rolls was just too frightfully common. I want to go to a different school, Dad, said Joe. No problem. I can afford to send you to the poshest schools in the world. I heard about this place in Switzerland. You ski in the morning and then... No, said Joe. How about I go to the local school? What? Said Mr. Spud. I might make a friend there, said Joe. He'd seen the kids milling around the school gates when he was being chauffeured to St. Cuthbert's. They all looked like they were having such a great time, chatting, playing games, swapping cards. To Joe, it all looked so fabulously normal. Yes, but the local school, said Mr. Spud, incredulously. Are you sure? Yes, replied Joe defiantly. I could build you a school in the back garden if you like, offered Mr. Spud. No, I want to go to a normal school with normal kids. I want to make a friend, Dad. I don't have a single friend at St. Cuthbert's. But you can't go to a normal school. You are a billionaire, boy. All the kids will either bully you or want to be friends with you just because you are rich. It might be a nightmare for you. Well, then I won't tell anyone who I am. I'll just be Joe. And maybe, just maybe, I'll make a friend or even two. Mr. Spud thought for a moment and then relented. If that's what you really want, Joe, then okay. You can go to a normal school. Joe was so excited. He jumped along the sofa nearer to his dad to give him a cuddle. Don't crease the suit, boy, said Mr. Spud. Sorry, Dad, said Joe, jumping back a little. He cleared his throat. I love you, Dad. Yes, son, ditto, ditto, said Mr. Spud as he rose to his feet. Well, have a good birthday, mate. Aren't we going to do something together tonight? Said Joe, trying to hide his disappointment. When he was younger, Joe's dad would always take him to the local burger restaurant as a birthday treat. They couldn't afford the burgers, so they would just order chips and eat them with some ham and pickle sandwiches that Mr. Spud would smuggle in under his hat. I can't, son. Sorry, I've got a date with this model tonight, said Mr. Spud, indicating an advert in the magazine. Joe looked at the page. There was a photograph of the woman. Well, I say, model, I can't wait to see her face. Don't you think Sapphire's a little young for you, Dad? It's only a 27-year age gap, replied Mr. Spud in an instant. Where are you going to? A nightclub. A nightclub? Said Joe. Yes, said Mr. Spud in an offended tone. I am not too old to go to a nightclub. As he spoke, he opened a box and pulled out what looked like a hamster that had been flattened by a hammer and put it on his head. What on earth is that, Dad? What's what, Joe? Replied Mr. Spud with mock innocence as he adjusted the contraption to cover his bald head. That thing on your head. Oh, this. It's a toupee, boy. Only 10 grand each. I bought a blonde one, a brown one, a ginger one, and an afro for special occasions. It makes me look 20 years younger, don't you think? Joe didn't like to lie. The toupee didn't make his dad look younger. Instead, it made him look like a man who was trying to balance a dead rat on his head. Therefore, Joe chose a non-committal, Right, well, have a good night, Joe added, picking up the remote. It looked like it would be just him and the TV again. There's some caviar in the fridge for your tea, son, said Mr. Spud as he headed for the door. What's caviar? It's fish eggs, son. Ew! Joe didn't even like normal eggs. Eggs laid by a fish sounded really revolting. Yeah, I had some on toast for me breakfast. It's absolutely disgusting, but it's very expensive and we should start eating it. Can't we just have bangers and mash or fish and chips or shepherd's pie or something, Dad? I used to love shepherd's pie, son. Mr. Spud drooled a little as if imagining the taste of shepherd's pie. Well then, Mr. Spud shook his head impatiently. No, we are rich, son. We have to eat all this posh stuff now like proper rich people do. See you later. The door slammed behind him, and moments later Joe heard the deafening roar of his father's lime green Lamborghini speeding off into the night. Joe was disappointed to be on his own again, but he still couldn't suppress a small smile as he turned on the TV. He was going to be an ordinary schoolboy again, and maybe, just maybe, make a friend. The question was, how long could Joe keep the fact that he was a billionaire a secret? Finally, the big day came. Joe took off his diamond-encrusted watch and put his gold pen in the drawer. He looked at the designer black snakeskin bag his dad had bought him for his first day at his new school and put it back in the cupboard. Even the bag that bag had come in was too posh. But he found an old plastic one in the kitchen and put his school books in that. Joe was determined not to stand out. From the back seat of his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, he had passed the local comprehensive many times on his way to St. Cuthbert's and seen the kids pouring out of the school, a rushing river of swinging bags and swear words and hair gel. Today he was going to enter the gates for the first time. But he didn't want to arrive by Rolls-Royce. That would be a pretty good hint to the other kids that he was rich. He instructed the chauffeur to drop him off at a nearby bus stop It had been quite a few years since he travelled by public transport, and as he waited at the bus stop, Joe tingled with excitement. "I can't change that," said the bus driver. Joe had realized that a £50 note was not going to be welcome to pay for a £2 fare, and he had to get off the bus. Sighing, he began to walk the 2 miles to school, his flabby thighs rubbing together as he took each step. Finally, Joe reached the school gates. For a moment, he waited nervously outside. He had spent so long living a life of wealth and privilege. How on earth was he going to fit in with these kids? Joe took a deep breath and marched across the playground. At registration, there was only one other kid sitting on his own. Joe looked over at him. He was fat, just like Joe, with a mop of curly hair. When he saw Joe looking over, he smiled. And when registration was over, he came over. "I'm Bob," said the fat boy. "Hi, Bob," replied Joe. The bell had just rung, and they waddled along the corridor to the first lesson of the day. "I'm Joe," he added. It was weird to be in a school where no one knew who he was, where he wasn't Bum Boy, or Billionaire Bum, or Bum Fresh Kid. "I'm so glad you're here, Joe. In the class, I mean." "Why is that?" asked Joe. He was excited. It looked like he might have found his first friend already. "Because I am not the fattest boy in the school anymore," Bob said confidently, as if stating an independently verified fact. Joe scowled, then stopped for a second and studied Bob. It looked to him like he and the other boy were about the same level of fattiness. "How much do you weigh then?" demanded Joe grumpily. "How much do you weigh?" said Bob. "Well, I asked you first." Bob paused for a second. "About 8 stone." "I'm 7 stone," said Joe, lying. "No way are you 7 stone," said Bob. "I'm 12 stone, and you are much fatter than me." "You just said you were 8 stone," said Joe accusingly. "I was 8 stone," replied Bob, "when I was a baby." That afternoon it was cross-country running. What a dreadful ordeal for any day at school, not at least your first day. It was a yearly torture that seemed designed solely to humiliate those kids who were not sporty. A category Bob and Joe could definitely be squeezed into. "Where is your running kit, Bob?" shouted Mr. Bruce, the PE teacher, as Bob made his way onto the playing field. Bob was wearing his white fronts and vest, and his appearance was greeted by a huge wave of laughter from the other kids. "Someone must have hidden it, sir," answered a shivering Bob. "Likely story," scoffed Mr. Bruce. Like most PE teachers, it was difficult to imagine him wearing anything other than a tracksuit. Do I still have to run, sir?" asked a hopeful Bob. "Oh, yes, boy, you don't get off that easily. Right, everyone, on your marks, get set, wait for it, go." At first, Joe and Bob sprinted away like all the other kids, but after about 3 seconds, they were both out of breath and were forced to walk. Soon everyone else had disappeared into the distance, and the 2 fat boys were left alone. "I come last every year," Bob said, unwrapping a Snickers and taking a large bite. "All the other kids always laugh at me. They get showered and dressed and wait at the finish line. They could all go home, but instead they wait just to jeer at me." Joe frowned. That didn't sound like fun. He decided he didn't want to be last and quickened his pace a little, making sure he was at least half a step ahead of Bob. Bob glared at him and piled on the speed, going up to at least half a mile an hour. From the determined expression on his face, Joe knew that Bob was hoping that this year was his golden chance not to finish last. Joe sped up a little more. They were now almost jogging. The race was on. For the ultimate prize, who was going to finish second last? Joe really didn't want to be beaten at cross-country running by a fat boy in his vest and pants on his first day at school. After what seemed like an eternity, the finish line hazed into sight. Both boys were out of breath with all this power waddling. Suddenly disaster struck Joe. A painful stitch burst in his side. "Ow!" cried Joe. "What's the matter?" asked Bob, now quite a few centimeters in the lead. "I've got a stitch. I've got to stop. Ow!" "You're bluffing," A 15-stone girl pulled that one on me last year and ended up beating me by a fraction of a second. Oh, it's true, said Joe, holding his side tightly. I ain't falling for it, Joe. You are going to be last, and this year all the kids in the yard are going to be laughing at you, said Bob triumphantly as he edged ahead still further. Bob being laughed at on his first day at school was the last thing Joe wanted. He had enough of being laughed at when he was at St. Cuthbert's. However, the stitch was becoming more and more painful with every step. It was as if it was burning a hole in his side. How about I give you a $5 to come last, he said. No way, replied Bob through heaving breaths. A tenner? No. $20? Try harder. $50? Bob stopped and looked around at Joe. $50, he said. That's a lot of chocolate. Yeah, said Joe, tons. You got the deal, but I want the money now. Joe searched through his shorts and pulled out a $50 note. What's that? It's a $50 note. I've never seen one before. Where did you get it? It was my birthday last week, you see, said Joe, stumbling over his words a little, and my dad gave me that as a present. The marginally fatter boy studied it for a moment, holding it up to the light as if it was a priceless artifact. Wow, your dad must be loaded. The truth would have blown Bob's fat mind that Mr. Spud had given his son $2 million as a birthday present. So Joe kept shum. No, not really, he said. Go on then, said Bob. I'll come last again. For $50, I would finish tomorrow if you like. Just a few paces behind me will be fine, said Joe. Then it will look real. Joe edged ahead, still gripping his side in pain. Hundreds of little cruelly smiling faces were coming into focus now. The new boy crossed the finish line with only a hum of mocking laughter. Trailing behind was Bob, clutching his $50 note, since there was no pockets in his Y-fronts. As he neared the finishing line, the kids started chanting. Blob, 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 blob. The chants grew louder and louder. They started clapping in time too. Blob, blob, blob. Undeterred, Bob hurled his body across the finish line. Ha 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 ha. The other kids fell around laughing, pointing at Bob as he bent over and panted for breath. Turning around, Joe felt a sudden twitch of guilt. As the school kids dispersed, he went over to Bob and helped him stand up straight. Thanks, said Joe. You're welcome, said Bob. To be honest, I should have done that anyway. If you came last on your very first day, you'd never hear the end of it. But next year, you're on your own. I don't care if you give me $1 million. I ain't coming last again. Joe thought about his $2 million check. What about $2 million? He joked. Deal, said Bob, laughing. Imagine if you really did have that much money. It would be crazy. I guess you could have everything you ever wanted. Joe forced a smile. Yeah, he said. Maybe.